As an archaeologist and classicist, I'm primarily interested in questions which allow us to examine our own world today. And what I'm going to present to you today is a look at material from the ancient world that allows us to question the boundaries, the borders between the self and the other, the citizen and the state, and public and private spheres. We're going to look at Roman surveillance systems, and in particular 4 different forms it took, including forts, walls, and military patrols, the invisible Roman army as it's positioned in the part of the Roman world that I work, the oversight of enslaved labor, and how Romans controlled their forced labor in mines, quarries, and around farm systems, and the internal security forces of the state. When we think of how Romans control technology, or to control landscapes and territory, we often think about their military. And throughout the Roman world, we see evidence of Rome building forts like this one, which you can see perhaps in this outline there. Only the ghosts of many of these structures are left. But these forts only controlled landscapes in very specific parts of the landscape, the territory. To control more, to spread their control outwards, Romans would engage in patrols. And we have evidence of these patrols in things like this. This is a Roman version of a map. And to draw maps, Romans don't draw a landscape and put roads on it. They instead follow the roads. And we see that Roman roads are often positioned very close to areas they want to surveil. So on this map, we see that the 7th Gimina Legion, a Gimina Legion is just one that's raised at the same time as another, travels to Portus Blindius from their base. Their first step on their travels to Portus Blindius, their patrol, would be to Rama. And Rama lies 7 miles away from their home base. Then Amaya, another 18 Roman miles, Valegia, and then Legio, and unfortunately there's a break, but this is probably another Roman legionary fort along the way. Perhaps they would have spent the night there. Octaviolca, Juliobriga, Arachillum, and finally to Portus Blindius. And then we have the signature of the Roman military officer who was in charge of this patrol, Gaius Lepidus. We're also familiar with Roman borders and border control stations. This is Hadrian's Wall in Britain. It stretches from one end of the island to the other across the Firth of Forth, the narrowest part of the island. And people who are familiar with it, if you've ever been there, you probably have been to one of the mile castles. Every mile there is a small fort, or fortlet, as the Brits are fond of saying. Sometimes outfitted still with the remains of towers. But what you won't see at Hadrian's Wall is that the Romans also inhabited the land beyond the wall, and what we would think of as enemy territory, the land of the hostile barbarians. Rome put towers, and all of these towers are within eyesight of the others. They formed a surveillance network that's able to signal from one tower to the other when threats are coming. You might remember from the Lord of the Rings movies when they light the fires to summon the riders of Rohan. That same sort of thing. And we have other evidence of this beyond simply the archaeological remains. We have inscriptions that explain why they do this. This inscription from the time of the Emperor Commodus reads that he secured the entire riverbank with watchtowers constructed from the ground up, as well as guardhouses placed throughout areas exposed to covert incursions of raiders. The idea was to secure the borders by putting vision on them, to let those who would threaten Rome know that they were being watched, and so spread Rome's hegemony, its power, out from what we might think of as its limits. Eyesight, knowledge, and the ability to report back what they had seen was how they controlled access to their empire. Along the German and Romanian border of Rome, or as the Romans called it, Germania and Dacia, we find evidence of 900 stone and timber watchtowers, all along what the Romans called a vallum, but it's a mound of earth that the Romans built, often in very straight lines. Romans are famous for their straight lines. And this was outfitted with towers all along the way. This is from the Column of Trajan, which still stands in Rome. It's a relief that tells the story in like a ribbon wrapped around this column all the way to the top. At the very beginning, it explains how Romans guarded their borders at the beginning of the war. And they used towers like this one. You might remember on the first slide, another set of towers like this. And attached to the front, up here, a signaling spire, a torch so they could signal at night. Perhaps in the daylight they used a form of semaphore, and we have textual evidence of this by authors like Caesar. But the Roman army wasn't always so overt in their use of surveillance. In the area I work, it's a part of Portugal called the Central Alentejo. The Romans invested the landscape with what we call the invisible Roman army. And this was likely in response to figures like this one. This is an image of Viriathus, who's become a great hero of Spain for his resistance to the Romans. Viriathus was, of course, like all of Rome's celebrated foes, at least early in its empire, was defeated by treachery. But the Romans called him first a bandit, and then they call him a dux, a leader. And then finally, one Roman author calls him the Romulus of Spain. Right? He is the founder of a civilization like Rome, but this time in Spain, the Romulus of Spain. And Viriathus was, we think, a guerrilla leader. Right? He resisted Roman power not with standing armies and pitched battles, but with a war of attrition. And in response to this, and lingering resistance after Viriathus, the Romans built not fortresses, but relationships in the communities around this region. They settled garrisons of soldiers within local communities. And we find only hints of this in the archaeology. Things like this, the remains of a Roman javelin, a pilum. We found evidence of armor, of weapons, but also of more quotidian things like the pottery that the soldiers brought with them, or their coins. And all of this worry was really centered around this mountain. Ancient authors tell us that Viriathus, the revolutionary, the rebel, had his headquarters on a mountain between the Guadiana River and the Tejo River in Portugal. This is the only mountain between the Guadiana River and the Tejo River. Sadly, modern development, especially cell phone towers, have really disrupted the archaeology on the mountain, and honestly, not much has been done there. But what has been done around the mountain has found, again, more and more evidence of this invisible army. We've also found, too, that the Romans incorporated locals in their control of the region. So, Serra de Ossa here. And my own research has focused on a watchtower inhabited perhaps not by Roman soldiers, but by early Roman settlers or members of the Roman auxilia. These are non-Romans who work for the Roman army, or local citizens who are trying to become Roman. It's hard to tell. But this watchtower is here at 9. It's called Caladinium. It has another local name called Little House of the Tailor, but that's a whole other story. Caladinium lies atop of this hill here. You can see some of our archaeologists walking down from the hill after a long day of work. And we excavated at Caladinium from 2010 to 2013 and found a structure that appears to date to the last few decades of the 1st century BCE. We know this because of artifacts like this one. That Caladinium had a very short occupational period. People only lived there for perhaps 1 generation, if that, before this tower and all of the others like it in the area were abandoned. This artifact, too, has a stamp on it, you see. It's the stamp of Dureus, a pottery workshop that we know was operating not in Iberia, but in Italy, and producing ceramics for the Roman military on the German border. So its presence here at Caladinium, far from the German border, is fairly suspicious. The tower, once fully excavated, this is the tower, appear to be, we estimate its height at about 6 meters. And so with the addition of a human standing on top, the tower would have had a 7.75 meters total height, with the person standing on top looking around. We also know that the human visual acuity can extend to around 6.5 to 7 kilometers, meaning that 6.5 kilometers away, in ideal conditions, you can see what someone else is doing in a landscape. You can see what they're doing. And of course, it's going to be much easier to pick out a group of people rather than an individual. So you can extend that visual acuity farther. With this knowledge, and with the data provided by the satellite, this is the Aster 2 GDIM satellite launched by NASA, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and Japan's Ministry of Culture and Economy. I was able to model vision within this landscape, to recreate a surveillance system as it may have existed 2,000 years ago. That satellite provided topographic maps. It's called a digital elevation map, a DEM, of the entire planet. But I only wanted this little part of it. And on that I placed all of the forts and tower enclosures in the landscape. And from this I was able to project the vision. This is part of that. With F9 is Caladinho, F10, F8, and F5 are others around. And with Viriathus's mountain, the Serra da Ossa, right beyond them. In this landscape, we also have a path that would eventually become a Roman road that ran through the territories of F8 and F9, and you see that they don't have overlapping visions, that one is positioned where the other can't look. So the path would run through one and then immediately enter into the vision of another. There's also a riverbed that runs here at F10. This riverbed, and it's in a very deep canyon, is invisible to F9. And so the Romans established a very small fort here that only has vision on that riverbed. Anyone passing through this landscape from south to north, southwest to northeast, or south to north, here, across the only pass to the Serra da Ossa, would have been under surveillance. Whether they were an indigenous person traveling to this indigenous settlement here, or whether they were a Roman patrol going from the Roman settlement, colonial settlement at Evora, north to the big marble quarries, or whether they were perhaps a guerrilla band trying to avoid the empire's gaze. Everyone would have been seen by these towers. You might be thinking that the Romans have instituted something like Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, the prison where every prisoner is under constant surveillance. Or as Foucault says, the panopticon that can be used in everyday life. But in a colonial system like what the Romans had, we must remember that the Romans are vastly outnumbered. And so there is ample opportunity to resist surveillance, to remain hidden, to seek privacy. And that's what the inhabitants, the indigenous people, did at this site, Rocha de Mina. Rocha de Mina is a small shrine, probably also with a domestic element. And it's hidden behind this enormous rock outcrops, this wall of stone. If you were to visit Rocha de Mina, you would see that wall of stone there blocking off access from both vision and from approach. But on the other side, where the site lays, there is a small stone wall. Now this wall would never have prevented Rocha de Mina from attack by the Romans. But it was probably intended to ward off bandits and unrest. And that's what this landscape we have to envision being as one that is just filled with bandits or guerrilla bands. The Romans would often characterize their enemies as bandits rather than giving them their rightful political due as opposing groups. Something similar we do perhaps with our current enemies. But this system of surveillance, if we look a century on, we can see that once these towers, F5, F8, F9, and F10 are abandoned, the Romans begin building these sites. You can see them, the small purple triangles. These represent the villas, elite residences, large farms in the region. And these large farms do not have surveillance. Even if we assume they have a tower positioned next to them, of the same qualities as were at these hilltops, these villas are not positioned to look at the landscape. They're no longer worried about bandits. This landscape has been pacified. There's no more danger of a man like Viriathus. What these villas do have, though, are towers like this one from a wall painting in Italy that are perhaps meant as means to watch their laborers in field systems, the slaves. Towers too, or this is not a tower, but rather a treehouse, were also constructed on an as-needed basis. And of course, these have no archaeological evidence remaining. It's very hard to detect temporary structures. But we know that they must have existed because the Romans built them, showed them there on their plates, and they also talk about them. Some very early Christian sermons talk about the overseer in a treehouse watching over the slaves as they work in an orchard or in a vineyard. So it's after Rome has conquered a region that the panopticon, or an attempt at, is dissolved. And instead we have the surveillance directed at people who can't resist, people who are forced to work, and that it is a mobile panopticon, one that moves around with them. We know too that it wasn't just an attempt to watch enslaved laborers or an attempt to monitor landscapes that are being colonized, but the Romans were concerned with even other Romans. And one of the things they instituted was the frumentarii. The frumentarii were originally grain officers. They handled the grain supply of the city and making sure that the provinces exported the right amount of grain into Rome. And these frumentarii eventually became something of the imperial post. They handled the correspondence between the emperor and his administrators, and they also kept an eye on the locals. They were very in tune with their communities. And they would report back on possible rebels, about the emperor's own friends and family members. Right? They handled the correspondence. They were like the mailmen of the Roman world. After a few centuries of this internal security agency, the frumentarii became remarkably unpopular, and the Roman people demanded that they be dissolved. And so the emperors replaced them with a new intelligence agency, one that was far more clandestine, and where we might see perhaps the hints of our own CIA and NSA. This agency, this Roman imperial bureaucracy, was called the agentes in rebus. That translates from Latin as the ones involved in matters. A rather vague title for an intelligence agency. I think it's appropriate. But these agentes, these agents, right, would monitor the internal threats to Rome's own state. And so we're left perhaps wondering, well, why? Why all of this? J.M. Smith, in her excellent Private Matters, discusses the importance of privacy and the danger of surveillance. And she says that feeling watched, but not knowing for sure, nor knowing if, when, or how the hostile surveyor may strike, people often become fearful, constricted, distracted. That surveillance is a weapon. It's meant to keep its targets off balance. It's meant to keep them powerless against the state. Thank you, guys.